of New York will take audiences back to a forgotten crossroads in American history when rival gangs battled for the streets of New York and the future of our country. Tonight, the Discovery Channel will dig up stories about the bandits and the bosses, the hustlers and the hucksters that made old New York a modern Babylon. We'll also show sneak peeks from gangs of New York, hear candid stories from the set, and listen in on an exclusive interview with director Martin Scorsese. It all starts now on Uncovering the Real Gangs of New York.
The real history of the gangs of 19th century New York is the story of the birth of America in these mean streets and the many different faces who forged her identity. As group after group of newcomers arrived on the shores of the city in the early 1800s, each vied with the others for homes, jobs, sustenance, and most of all, respect. The gangs of New York came together out of necessity in a place of chaos.
Yes, there's a police department, but what do the police do? Who are they? How many are they? Do they carry guns? Do they not carry guns? Will they be paid for by the city or the state or something else? A lot of these issues are up for grabs. So the kind of ordered life that we live in the 21st century was not quite arranged early in the 19th century.
The poor neighborhoods had little police protection. A cop was little more than a night watchman on the lookout for fires. So by joining gangs, immigrants were creating their security forces.
They needed to band together for protection because if you were solo walking down the street and you happened to turn the wrong corner, you'd get jumped. So you needed backup, you needed your boys. There was a policeman on the corner primarily to assure that the poor did not assault the rich. They didn't care so much about what the poor did to one another.
The gangs were rooted in the most dangerous slum in New York, some say the entire world, known as the 5 Points. Five Points was named for the intersection of 5 streets, just a few blocks northeast of where the World Trade Center stood, at the top of what is now Chinatown, and the bottom of Little Italy. Originally, those streets were Cross, Anthony, Little Water, Orange, and Mulberry. Paradise Square flanked the 5 Points, just blocks above City Hall. Living conditions in the 5 Points shocked and appalled both Walt Whitman and Charles Dickens. Dickens wrote, "Debauchery has made the very houses prematurely old." No one sets out to build a slum. It was created by default. The 5 Points were originally countryside, dotted by a spring-fed lake known by the Dutch as the Collect.
When the Collect Pond was drained, it was drained by means of a canal that ran down what is now Canal Street, the area still stank, and only the poorest people wanted to live there.
Sewage placed too closely to wells caused cholera and other diseases to run rampant.
The sanitation was horrible. I mean, and the living circumstances were horrible because conditions were so horribly crowded. I mean, there were these front tenements, and then there was a back tenement, and then in the little tiny open space in between the front and back tenement was some overflowing ghastly cesspool. And imagine what the smells must have been.
It stunk with the excrement of horses and pigs and dogs and cats, and it stunk from rotted food. Americans don't think bathing is so good, and it's not a tradition.
And the rickety buildings in the 5 Points were sinking, literally, into the swampy landfill they'd been built upon. It fell to the lowest on the ladder in New York society to live in the 5 Points. That meant recently freed slaves and other new arrivals. Unskilled Irish, who were fleeing famine and willing to work for even less than the black labor force. As the first sizable group of Catholics to arrive in New York, the Irish were met with suspicion by distrusting Americans.
And that reflected very much a common American belief that the Irish were of a different race, that they were racially inferior, religiously inferior, really in every way inferior.
They also have a tradition of rural violence, of resistance to landlords, of secret society, of gangs that exist in the Irish countryside. And when they come over here, they resort to the same things that they had there.
The immigrants' new neighborhood was impoverished, essentially lawless, and fertile ground for the growth of some of the most notorious gangs this country has ever seen. The classic book by Herbert Asbury, Gangs of New York, An Informal History of the Underworld, chronicles the many gangs' violent exploits. The book became a cult favorite that inspired many other works of history and served as the loose inspiration for the fictional movie Gangs of New York.
When you read this stuff, it's always exaggerated, but it's based on a kind of reality. And it tells you of a world that is basically unknown to most Americans, but as fantastic as the world of the Wild West.
Asbury's text is a colorful introduction to an era gone by, starting in pre-Civil War New York. It is based on lurid journalism of the day and oral history and legends of gangs.
Well, there were two sorts of gangs, essentially. There were the native-born American gangs, that is, native-born Anglo-Saxons, and then there were Irish immigrant gangs. The most important gangs did favors for politicians, they acted as muscle in disputes, they controlled turf, they extorted from shopkeepers, because these were career moves for the poor.
The gangs were legendary, and the penny press of the day gave them names and covered their rumbles with glee. There were Bowery Boys and Broadway Boys, Carryonians and Chichesters, the Plug Uglies, and the Dead Rabbits.
There's a famous gang called the Dead Rabbits, and historians have speculated a long time about where this name came from. One professor has pointed out that Dead Rabbit is Irish, and the Irish language means big, hulking galoot. So what they really told, some newspaper man came down to the Lower East Side who didn't know Irish and said, "What's that group over there? What are they doing?" And someone who spoke Irish said, "Oh, they're Dead Rabbits." And then the newspaper reprinted that they're Dead Rabbits, and they became a gang.
Their brawls were real enough, and the lingo they generated lasted.
Dead Rabbits refers to two things. First, the word dead, which means like real, absolute, very much. And rabbit, which is a tough guy. So these are the very tough guys, but in the flash lingo of the time, they were the Dead Rabbits. And at least according to legend, they marched into battle with an actual deceased member of the rabbit species impaled on a pole.
For the first half of the 19th century, there were no professional firefighters, and all firemen were volunteers. Gangs formed around the various firehouses, which functioned as their private social clubs.
Gangs in American cities cannot be separated from the subject of volunteer fire companies. After all, the biggest problem in really before 1800, maybe as late as 1850, in an American city was not what we might think today as crime or mugging or drugs. The problem to them was fire, because if something caught on fire, first of all, the houses were all together, the whole city could go up.
Insurance companies of the day rewarded the first fire company on the scene with a cash payout, less for the second to arrive.
So you wanted to get there first to get money. What would you do with the money? They didn't hand it out to people. It goes essentially into the party fund.
The reward money funded the social life of the firehouse.
We know that they were sometimes ridiculously inefficient. There are various stories of fire companies duking it out for the privilege of putting out the fire. Meanwhile, the building burned down.
If one fire company made it to the scene, or a member of one fire company made it to the scene, they would put a barrel over the wooden fire plug in the street and try and defend it from other fire laddies, other fire companies, until their guys arrived.
Hence, the term Plug Ugly was born, and another gang was christened.